Once this was a sea, not a symbol, not a metaphor. A real body of water that existed without needing to be remembered. Water touched the shore every morning. Boats left before sunrise and returned heavy. Fish filled the nets. Salt stayed in the water where salt belonged. People did not admire the Aral Sea. They relied on it. And reliance creates a dangerous kind of trust. That is why no one noticed the first retreat. The shoreline moved slowly, quietly, a few steps farther each year, too small to feel alarming, too gradual to feel wrong. Authorities called it development, engineers called it control, farmers called it hope. Everyone else trusted the plan, because no one imagines killing a sea. Not slowly, not deliberately, not while promising abundance, not until the air begins to change, not until the wind carries dust instead of moisture, not until ships stand motionless on cracked ground, still facing a horizon where water no longer exists. The Aral Sea did not vanish. It was taken apart, carefully, confidently, drop by drop. This is not a story about nature turning cruel. This is a story about humans believing they could reorganize the world and leaving before the consequences finished unfolding. Before it became a warning, the Aral Sea was ordinary, and that ordinariness was its shield. It lay between deserts, quietly doing what it had always done, holding moisture in the air, softening the heat, keeping the land from breaking apart. Summers were harsh, but survivable. Winters were cold, but expected. Villages followed the shoreline like a habit learned over generations. Ports worked without ambition. Fishing was not heroic. It was routine. It was enough. Children grew up believing the water would always return because it always had. 2 rivers fed the sea year after year, bringing snowmelt and rain from distant mountains. Distance did not matter. The water always arrived. No one worried about limits because the sea never seemed to end. When the plan arrived, it did not sound violent. It sounded reasonable. Features needed irrigation. Cotton promised prosperity. Canals promised efficiency. Langs were drawn across maps with confidence. Rivers were redirected with certainty. Water was measured, allocated, controlled. No one said the sea would disappear. They said it would adjust. At first, it did. The waterline stepped back, but slowly. Boats still floated. Fish still came. The change felt manageable, almost polite. A few fishermen noticed the distance growing. They spoke quietly. But the fields were green. The harvest was strong. The numbers looked right. And numbers are persuasive. So the warnings stayed small, and the canals grew wider. The Aral Sea was still there, but it was already losing ground, and no one was listening closely enough to hear it. At some point, the sea stopped retreating politely. It began to hurry. The shoreline did not move a few steps anymore. It moved far enough to be noticed. Boats needed longer ropes. Fishermen woke earlier. Children no longer played where they used to, because the water was no longer there. The rivers kept flowing, but not toward the sea. They were pulled away channel by channel, field by field. The canals did not look violent. They looked organized. Straight lines, clean edges, control made visible from above. And control always feels reassuring until it starts to work too well. The sea grew shallower. Fish changed their paths. Then they disappeared. The nets returned light. Empty boats returned silent.
The ports did not close at once. They waited, because waiting had worked before. But this time, the water did not come back. The wind began to change. It no longer carried moisture from the sea. It carried dust, salt, dried poison from the exposed seabed. The air tasted sharp. The land began to crack. Fields still grew cotton, but the soil underneath was dying, and dying soil does not announce itself. It simply stops responding. People noticed sickness first, coughs that did not go away, eyes that burned, skin that did not heal. They did not connect it to the sea, not yet, because the sea was supposed to be far away, and distant things are easy to ignore. The maps were updated, the shoreline redrawn, the sea renamed into smaller pieces, because shrinking something on paper makes it feel manageable. But the Aral Sea was no longer listening to maps. It was leaving faster than language could follow.
The moment the ships stopped moving, the truth could no longer be delayed. They stood still on land that used to breathe with water. Hulls cracked, paint peeled, rust spread slowly, like a second burial. The seafloor turned into a plain, no waves, no reflection. Just exposed earth covered in salt and memory. The wind learned new routes. It crossed the former seabed without resistance. It lifted poison left behind by decades of use, and it carried it inland, into villages, into lungs, into blood. The storms did not look dramatic. They looked ordinary. That was the danger. Dust storms replaced rain. Clouds passed without giving anything back. The climate changed its mind. Summers grew hotter, winters sharper. The balance was gone. And balance, once lost, does not return on command. People began to leave, not all at once. Some stayed, because staying is easier than admitting loss. Towns emptied quietly. Schools closed. Shops followed. The ports became museums without walls. Children grew up surrounded by ships that never moved, learning that water was something their parents remembered. The Aral Sea was no longer a sea. It was a warning written across thousands of square kilometers. But warnings do not scream. They wait. And the land waited, poisoned, exposed, irreversible. While the world learned how easy it is to kill something vast, as long as you do it slowly enough. Leaving did not happen suddenly. It happened the way everything else had happened around the Aral Sea. Slowly, quietly, without ceremony. Families packed what they could justify carrying. Houses were locked without knowing if they would ever be opened again. Feed were abandoned, not because people stopped believing in work, but because the land stopped answering effort. The dust did not leave with them. It stayed. It settled into walls, into soil, into lungs. Children who had never seen the sea grew up breathing what it left behind. Doctors noticed patterns. They did not call them disasters. They called them statistics. Respiratory illness, birth complications, eyes that failed early, lives shortened without a single dramatic cause. The poison did not kill loudly. It accumulation. And accumulation is harder to fight than catastrophe, because there is no moment to point at and say, this is when it happened. The Aral Sea did not haunt people as a memory. It haunted them as an environment. The air itself carried consequences, and air cannot be avoided. The governments changed. The language changed.
The responsibility dissolved into time, because when damage stretches across decades, it becomes easier to call it inevitable. Towns faded from maps, the ports became skeletons of function without purpose, and the ships remained, not as monuments, but as reminders that something enormous had once been here and had been allowed to disappear. The people left, but the damage learned how to live on its own. The Aral Sea is often described as a mistake, but mistakes suggest surprise. This was not a surprise. It was a process, repeatedly approved, fully documented, and never truly stopped. Because the system that killed the sea never disappeared. It simply moved elsewhere. The lesson was written clearly. A vast body of water can be erased without hatred, without urgency, without malice. All it takes is patience and confidence, and the belief that consequences will remain abstract. The Aral Sea does not accuse anyone. It does not need to. It exists now as absence, as space where something irreversible occurred. It reminds us that nature does not negotiate. It responds. And response does not care about intention. The sea did not die because humans were cruel. It died because humans were certain. And certainty is often more dangerous than ignorance. Today, the Aral Sea survives only in fragments, puddles pretending to be continuity, names pretending to be meaning. But the empty space remains, and empty spaces are never truly empty. They are records. They show what happens when control is mistaken for wisdom, when efficiency replaces restraint, when progress is measured without asking what must be sacrificed. The Aral Sea is no longer asking to be saved. That moment passed. It now serves a different role: to wait, to remain visible enough to be remembered, and to stand as proof that even something vast, ancient, and life-giving can be undone, as long as it is undone slowly. And somewhere else, another shoreline is already beginning to move.